Hello, and welcome to this workshop on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD for short. I will be sharing with you a lot of information gleaned from a variety of sources, primarily the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA, the Fetal Alcohol Disorders Society, also known as FASLink, the National Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome, also known as NOFAS, and FASD Forever, a rich informational website and YouTube channel by author and educator Jeff Noble. We'll have their contact information for you at the end of the workshop. These are very helpful organizations that are working hard to inform and equip caregivers of children with FASD. What I'm sharing with you today is information that I wish we would have had access to 22 years ago when we started adopting our 4 children from hard places. But it wasn't available because much of it had yet to be discovered. In fact, some of the most helpful information of all is only 3 to 5 years old. FASD, as we'll see in a minute, describes neurological and physical impairments the child with FASD deals with. FASD is one of the heaviest forms of neurodevelopmental trauma that is common in children today, especially children coming through the foster and adoptive systems. Sometimes people like to focus on things like IQ as a way to anticipate a child's future success. But IQ only measures our capacity to learn. Our neurological functioning describes how well we use that information. It really doesn't take that much knowledge or learning to bump along in life well enough if we can use what we know well. If we cannot use what we know well, our life is a series of mistakes, train wrecks, and disappointment. In order to function in society, we need our brains to function well. If they don't do that, we will have a lifelong problem to deal with. A neurologically injured child is often unable to meet the expectations of parents, family, peers, school, and career, and can endure a lifetime of failures. The largest cause of neurological damage in children today is prenatal exposure to alcohol. These children grow up to become adults with neurological damage. Often the neurological damage goes undiagnosed, but not unpunished. And that's the real issue, that neurological damage has occurred and causes long-term challenges that do not go away. We'll talk more in a minute about the effects of fetal alcohol exposure, but right now we want to define some of the terms that we use. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD, is an umbrella term that includes the variety of disorders stemming from fetal alcohol exposure. So let's take a quick look at some of the terms that you will hear. First, there's fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. This describes a series of neurological impairments accompanied by certain specific malformation of facial features. And they need to exhibit 3 or 4 of the following. 1, a thin upper lip. 2, smoothened area between the upper lip and nose. Or 3, a wide bridge at the base of the nose. And 4, a thickening of the skin around part of the eyes. In addition to these features, the children also exhibit a growth deficiency. They tend to be in the smallest 25 percentile or less in height and weight. And the child also exhibits central nervous system dysfunctions, and it's known that their mothers drank heavily during pregnancy. One of the reasons that this group is so small, only 2 to 10% of cases, is that those facial features that so clearly set them off are only present if the mother used alcohol on days 19, 20, and 21 of the pregnancy. The next term is partial FAS, or PFAS. It is essentially identical to FAS, but the child only exhibits 1 or 2 of the FAS facial features, but still has all the other associated impairments. Then we come to alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or ARND. In ARND, none of the facial features are present, but all of the other associated impairments are there. This is the largest group of all. 90% of all cases of FASD are ARND. And because there are no visible signs of impairment, their challenges are often misdiagnosed or just taken for character defects. The last term is fetal alcohol effects, or FAE. This is also a kind of umbrella term that describes PFAS and ARND. So FAS plus FAE equals all of FASD. Before going further, we want to take a moment to look at some sobering facts about FASD. To sum up just a little, we know that FASD is the leading known cause of preventable mental retardation. The Center for Disease Control in February of 2016 estimated that up to 1 in 20 school children may have FASD. That's essentially 5%. They also estimate that 2 to 5% of the population at large. Now, the CDSS in California estimates this to be nearly 10% in California. NOFAS adds that children in the foster care system are 10 to 15 times more likely to have FASD than the general population. That means 50 to 75%. In fact, FASD is more common than autism, and the effects of FASD last a lifetime. Now, people with FASD can grow, improve, and function relatively well in life with the proper support, and that's the key. FASD is a lifetime disability. It is not curable. A child does not grow out of it. However, early diagnosis and intensive and appropriate intervention can make an enormous difference in the prognosis for the child. There are better ways to care for a child with FASD, and when those ways are carried out, there can be significant improvement of day-to-day functioning of the child in the family or at school. But real damage cannot be entirely reversed. It's permanent, and it must always be compensated for. Care that is heavily oriented towards connection and that accurately takes into account the nature of the child's disability can go much smoother than trying to use more traditional punishment-oriented behavioral training. And so that's really the heartbreaking reality of FASD. So many other neurological dysfunctions can be addressed, sometimes with remarkable improvement. But with FASD, there is improvement, but with lesser results and much slower progress. As we begin to look at how FASD affects a child, let's start out with something positive. It's always important to identify strengths in people with whom you are working with or you live with. Otherwise, it's difficult to address a person's needs adequately. This is a general list of strengths often seen in people with FASD. It is by no means exhaustive, nor are all these strengths seen in everyone with FASD. Some of these strengths, like being friendly and helpful, can pose difficulties. For instance, doing whatever someone asks without awareness of the possible consequences because you just want to be friendly. But let's take a look at what some of these strengths are. People with FASD are friendly and cheerful. They're likable. They're verbal, extremely verbal. They want to be helpful. They desire to be liked, and they will do things to make that happen. They are determined. They have points of insight. Sometimes it's amazing. They'll get a flash of understanding about themselves or about somebody else. They're hardworking. Every day is a new day, and they're not malicious. For the most part, people with FASD are not malicious and rarely act with premeditation. They're just way too impulsive for that. All right, now it's time to take a look at what FASD might look like in a child. So we'll talk about primary disabilities. Primary disabilities are characteristics or behaviors that reflect differences in brain structure and function. They are hardwired, so to speak, into the brain. Again, not every child suffering with FASD exhibits all of these traits, but let's look at some of them. The first we want to look at is overall dysmaturity and developmental delays. Children with FASD function at an age level roughly half their chronological age. And this may vary differently depending on the domain that you are talking about, but the general average is that they function at about half the level of their chronological age, which is very important to remember. A frequent complaint of parents or caregivers with children with FASD is that they don't act their age, and there is a reason, because of this overall dysmaturity. Another disability is memory dysfunctions. Their memory can go on and off. One child with FASD said that his memory was like Swiss cheese. Or they might have trouble actually using facts that they may have memorized. In general, children with FASD often have very poor memory skills. The next primary disability is attention deficits. Children have a hard time staying focused. Most children with FASD have an ADHD diagnosis, which is accurate, but also a little misleading because there's a lot more going on. Another primary disability is auditory processing dysfunctions. Children with FASD may only hear every fifth word or less. They may also hear the words, but not know what to do with them. They may have a hard time processing verbal commands. Thus, they may look defiant or uncooperative, and this is very common. They also typically have sensory processing problems. Their senses are either hypersensitive or undersensitive, and that can cause all sorts of behavioral issues. Another primary disability is slower cognition. In some cases, there is actually a lower IQ, but sometimes their brains just work slower than others. Good advice is to give them 5 to 10 seconds to process before going on to the next task or topic. Another is impulsivity issues. This is very common and a big challenge. An almost universal trait that explains a lot of other behaviors, frankly, and a lot of the secondary traits. Children with FASD are just massively impulsive. They're moving before they've even thought about what they're doing. Oftentimes, they also have learning dysfunctions, especially language and reading problems. And reading problems can be in the domain of decoding or reading comprehension. They also can have problems with spelling and math skills, just basically difficulties of all kinds in the education arena. Another primary characteristic is that they often have a difficult time understanding natural or logical consequences. They just don't seem to grasp cause and effect very well, at least at times. Natural consequences make a little sense to them, but logical consequences just don't. Hence, they are not helpful to use to lead to behavioral change. Their brains just don't grasp those concepts well enough. They also can have difficulty with abstract concepts. They are very concrete thinkers. Concepts like time and value are very hard for them to grasp. Well, having looked at primary disabilities, let's take a moment to look at some secondary disabilities. Secondary disabilities are disabilities that the individual is not born with. These disabilities and behaviors develop over time because of a poor fit between the person and their environment. They are the result of living with the mistakes, failure, aggravation, frustration, and feelings of hopelessness that kiddos with FASD have to deal with day after day. It's important to stress that these are entirely preventable. As we continue to look at secondary disabilities, let's take a brief glimpse, statistically, into the future of a child with undiagnosed or poorly treated FASD. Now, these are some statistics on secondary characteristics that we want to avoid. So what are some of those secondary characteristics? Well, one, mental health problems. In fact, statistically, if they don't have a diagnosis or are poorly treated, 95% of people with FASD will have mental health problems. 68% will have disrupted school experience. That's either referring to repeated suspensions or even expulsion or dropped out of school. 68% will experience trouble with the law. 55% will be confined in prison, drug or alcohol treatment center, or a mental institution. 82% will not be able to live independently. 70% will have problems with employment. Now, these are very sobering statistics, and really they just highlight the importance of early diagnosis and proper treatment, because they make all the difference. And it doesn't really take as much effort as you might think to make a big difference. Here are some of the factors that reduce secondary disabilities. First and foremost, a stable home environment. Then, recognize disabilities. Their caregivers know what's going on. An early diagnosis of FASD, appropriate interventions, no violence against the child, a good quality home from ages 8 to 12. Now this one's really a surprise. More than 2.8 years in each living situation. So this speaks to children with FASD who are in the foster care system. And if they can stay in the foster home for at least 2.8 years each time, it reduces the possibility of those secondary characteristics. And that their basic needs are met for at least 13% of their life. Like I said, it doesn't take as much as you think to make an impact in reducing those secondary disabilities. How do you identify if your child has FASD? Well, only trained professionals can truly diagnose a disorder from the FASD spectrum. Ideally, diagnosis is done by a team of individuals that might include geneticists, developmental pediatricians, neurologists, dysmorphologists, education consultants, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, occupational therapists, and speech and language specialists. It's not easy to get a diagnosis of FASD unless you can document or are certain of the birth mother's use of alcohol while pregnant, and you can document the existence of developmental delays and dysfunctions. A developmental pediatrician or neurologist is usually a good place to get started. There has been an explosion of research and findings in neurology and brain development in the last 3 to 5 years. And this has really impacted the way parents and caregivers support individuals dealing with FASD. There are strategies to assist persons with FASD and their families to continue to increase dynamically. Recent discoveries in brain and neurological research have uncovered some very encouraging discoveries. Of particular note are the critical effects of attachment and neuroplasticity in showing us how the brain can rewire itself when there is a close connection to a loving and stable caregiver. This brain science has influenced and created some proven techniques for parents and caregivers to use to help redress many aspects of neurological impairments. One of these strategies is called trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI for short, which also provides proven help in working with FASD children, as well as many other types of neurological conditions. If you'd like more on that, you can go to empoweredtoconnect.org and learn all about it. Correctly diagnosing FASD has many benefits. It will decrease the frustration and anger in persons with FASD about not being like others their age. It can be a bitter pill for them to swallow, so be prepared for that. But in the end, The more they embrace the diagnosis, the better the outcome will be. It can also decrease the frustration and anger of caregivers towards the individual when they realize that the individual is not just being willful. This is a huge deal. The truth is can't, not won't. Bottom line, accurately identifying a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and intervening appropriately can improve outcomes in any setting: school, vocational services, treatment, corrections, and family life. So let's get practical. Here are the 6 key areas that caregivers of children with FASD need to embrace if they want to effectively care for a child with FASD. What are these areas? 1, we have to deal with grief and loss. We have to learn to think differently. We need to create new hopes and dreams. We need to deal with burnout. We need to know what works and what doesn't work. And we need to know about support resources because we're going to need them. So let's talk about the first area, grief and loss. What is grief and why would it be important to address? I've come to understand that grief is best understood as the thoughts and feelings we experience from a deep loss that is profound enough for us to feel changed in ways we do not want. Thus, we are overwhelmed and refuse to initially accept the new reality of our future life. We cling to what was lost and resist losing it. Not only does the child with FASD experience grief and loss, as they come to realize that they are different in ways they do not often like or want, but caregivers also experience tremendous grief and loss. FASD educator Donna DeBolt once said, "We have to give up what we thought it was going to be like and take on what it really is." I know, easier said than done. But whether you realize it or not, before this child came into your life, you had expectations and dreams of what it would be like. Yeah. And by now you've probably experienced the shattering of those dreams, and that is a loss. If you want to get back in balance, you need to acknowledge your loss and accept your new reality. It's the only way. You will never be the same again, but that does not mean you will always be miserable. Some of the realities of raising a child with FASD that can cause grief and loss are loss of peace in the home. Many FASD children have behavioral issues that bring on a certain amount of chaos in the home. This takes a heavy toll on other children in the home and often causes friction and stress between spouses. The daily chaos and struggle can become such an ongoing problem that some family members will just want to do anything that will ease the pain. There's also a profound loss in the ability to revel in your FASD child. You hear other people rejoicing in the accomplishments of their children, and you find that you just have so few genuine accomplishments to rejoice. Or at least it sure seems that way sometimes. Now, some caregivers make the adjustments and find ways to rejoice in even the smallest of accomplishments. And that is a really good thing that I encourage. But not everyone can do that without a lot of effort. It's important that you recognize and accept these losses so you can find new dreams and things to revel about. The next area we want to focus on is learning to think differently and adapting our expectation. A new way of thinking makes all the difference. Caregivers often find that their ability to cope with the child's behavior changes dramatically when they understand that the problems are most likely based on organic brain damage rather than the child's choice. Here are some examples of how such a thinking paradigm shift might look. When we use our understanding of FASD, it can help us reinterpret their actions. We have to start looking at behavior as symptoms, not just misbehavior. In fact, it actually helps to start calling them symptoms. So let's look at the slide and see what needs to change into what. Like, for instance, we mentioned before, in our old way of thinking, we'd say, he won't do what I'm telling him. In our new way of thinking, we'd say, he can't. It's is beyond his scope, or I need to give him more time. We might say things like, well, he doesn't try. And when we understand what's going on, we might realize that he's actually just tired of failing, or maybe he's exhausted. We might complain that in our old way of thinking that he's acting younger. And in our new understanding, we would recognize he is developmentally younger. And so that's not a problem. A new way of thinking. We must unlearn what you have learned and learn to do things differently. It really is the bedrock of what you're going to do. But it isn't all just about accepting a new reality and living with lesser expectations. That can seem like quite a downer. In addition to understanding the truth, we also need to create new hopes and dreams. We want to start out by redefining success. The future of a child with FASD may not look like you had originally planned or dreamed, but that doesn't mean they can't have a good future. There are adults with FASD who are quite successful. We just have to change our definition of success, as Jeff Noble says. He goes on to add, just because someone living with fetal alcohol can't be an astronaut doesn't mean they can't work for NASA in some way. And because your kiddo will never become a doctor doesn't mean he will never be able to work at a hospital. You get the idea. We have to let go of our hopes and dreams of the past and embrace the good that can still be. And as much as you and I have to do this, so does the child with FASD. They too must find ways to dream appropriate dreams. They can have a tendency to inflate what they are capable of, at least on the outside. But we need to help them gently and wisely embrace a future that is just a little different than what they might start out heading towards. Now, don't tell them what they can't do. They will often refuse to accept that, or they will accept it and it will shatter their self-image. Either way is bad. So don't tell them what they cannot do. Focus on the realistic things that they can likely do. Help them to get excited about that. As caregivers, we also need to prevent and deal with burnout. For caregivers of children with FASD, burnout looks a little different. What is burnout? Well, according to Diane Malbin, chronic failures associated with a discrepancy between the perceived ability of the individuals living with FASD and their actual ability or performance creates burnout. It's a process that takes time, and likewise recovering also takes time. Jeff Noble adds, and I think he clarifies this very well. He says, we don't experience burnout because those with FASD couldn't perform what we expect just once. We experience burnout from feeling let down and disappointed by them over and over and over and over and over again. Burnout is almost inevitable because it is a real challenge to go day, by month, by year, caring for a child with FASD. Now, don't get me wrong, some days are great, but some days, frankly, you can just get so tired dealing with the same issues that seem to never get much better. Now, if they're little things, that's not so bad, but they're not always so little. And that really wears on you because, after all, you're only human. Well, what are the symptoms of burnout? Now, there are more than we've listed here, of course, but here are some of the more typical symptoms of burnout. The first is exhaustion of physical and mental resources. In other words, you're always tired. You feel frazzled much of the time. You might want to sleep a lot, or you might find it hard to sleep at all. That kind of exhaustion is a symptom of burnout. Another is to be wearing yourself out by excessively striving to reach some unrealistic expectation imposed by yourself or others. You're so focused on getting your child to some goal or some point that you're kind of obsessed, and it just starts to bog you down and you can't see it. You just keep pushing. I experience that symptom a lot. Another symptom is prolonged discomfort including anger and fear. Basically, the wear and tear of each day starts to turn into anger or fear, and it starts to take over and become your go-to emotion. I experienced that as well. Be very careful of that. Another is increasing frustration and decreasing tolerance. And it's pretty self-explanatory. As your frustration level increases, it tends to make us become more intolerant, which only fuels the fire and makes it worse. Another symptom of burnout is feeling unappreciated, feeling anger and resentment and disillusionment. Now, I think every parent feels unappreciated to some extent. I know it's a common complaint. In general, frustration and anger typically lead to resentment. I didn't sign up for this. This is so not fair. However, if left unchecked, this can lead to disillusionment, where you just nag out and you assume the worst at all times, or even worse, you just stop caring. It's a dangerous place to get to. Another symptom is depression, denial of feelings, and your relationships begin to suffer. Now, of course, with all that frustration, confusion, and weariness, your poor brain can end up shorting out and depression can settle in. That, of course, affects all of our other relationships as well. And it's a fact that if you're not proactive, caring for a special needs child can be very hard on a marriage. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Every child with FASD is completely unique. And I have found that the comments, criticism, and judgment of others who parent more normal or neurotypical children are often the source of much confusion, guilt, shame, and frustration. And it's easy to see why it so easily afflicts us, because they're using ideas and philosophies and expectations that we ourselves once embraced. Those methodologies work for them because their children are neurotypical. Ours are not. Having a number of people question what you are doing or not doing starts to make you question yourself. Honestly, it's probably most prudent to be very careful who you trust with your struggles. Few people are really safe to talk to. You don't want to have your children's issues gossiped about the community, giving your children a bad reputation. I would suggest you be prepared ahead of time on how you will ignore or deflect the arrows that come from those who mean well and those who judge you and think you're a fool. It helps to have 2 or 3 statements memorized so that you can use them quickly in the moment. But bottom line, be prepared ahead of time how you want to respond so that you aren't left speechless or you don't retort in anger. Create a script and stick with the script. And please don't give in to comparing yourself with others. It only leads to suffering. Even comparing yourself with parents of other children with FASD. Don't do that. And the last source of burnout that I want to mention is what I call the tyranny of success. Because some days are good days. Your kiddo makes a good choice or handles something really well that they don't usually do so hot with, and you feel proud of them. Now watch out. Just because they succeeded one day doesn't mean they will do it that way from now on. Be on your guard so that you don't ratchet up your expectations. You will only be disappointed. Be glad when they do things well, but don't expect them to automatically do it that way from now on, because it just probably will not happen that way. Here are some things that can help you avoid or deal with burnout. The first, pick your battles and know your triggers. We really need to know our own pet peeves. You know, those things that cause us to lash out irrationally, those things that cause us to react poorly, often in an unreasonable way. And if we can identify those hot buttons, it helps us to understand that we're not really mad at the person living with FASD. Instead, we realize they just hit one of our triggers. Don't take it personally. So don't let yourself be surprised by stuff that is off the wall, because you're going to need to get used to that. Maybe it's best to ask yourself, will this hurt them? Will this hurt me? Will it hurt anyone else? And if the answer is no, maybe just let it go for now. Remember, kiddos with FASD live in the present and can't see some of the consequences that may lie ahead. They can't anticipate anything going wrong with their plans. Now, if they're going to do something that you have to disagree with, well, then negotiate the outcome you want. That way they get a little bit of what they want and you can avoid a possible meltdown by having to say no. Kids with FASD hear no so often. Try to find a way to say yes. Another thing to help is to protect your other relationships with your spouse and your other children. Because it's a fact that kiddos with FASD tend to dominate your time and energy, sometimes leaving little left for the other people in your life. It would be easy to say, don't let that happen, but realistically, they really do take a lot of effort to manage well. So try to plan regular time each day or week with your other children and your spouse. If you and your spouse can work together to take turns, the other is freed up to spend time with the other children. No, we'll talk about respite in just a moment. Another thing you can do that helps with burnout is to vent. If you hold in your frustration or fears, it can really tear you up inside. Find someone who is safe, who won't judge you for the intensity of your emotions, and who won't repeat what you share. It may be hard to find someone like that, but try to find someone like that. It's really important. I have sometimes forgotten this and vented to people who really were not that safe. And boy, was I sorry. Their judgment was pretty devastating. Silly me. I should have known better. But in my opinion, that's why it isn't good to just hold it inside. Sooner or later, it will pop out. And you want it to pop out in a good situation, not a risky one. Another thing you can do is go for a walk. Exercise is very helpful in relieving stress, and you do need to relieve stress. In the heat of the moment or after a lengthy situation, go for a walk, get on a treadmill, hit a punching bag, jump on a trampoline, take a bike ride, or go for a run. Respite is a way to help avoid burnout. This is an extremely helpful thing. You need to plan on regular times when you can get away from your responsibilities. But this really is not a job for just any babysitter. You need to have someone who understands your situation, who understands that your child is dealing with FASD and what that means. And you need someone who's going to be tolerant and flexible. A couple of hours is not going to be enough, although that can help a little. What you need sometimes is a few days or even weeks where you are relieved of caregiving for your FASD child. Now, this can be hard to arrange for sure. Foster care agencies already build this into their support system for foster parents. Adoptive parents have a harder time lining this up, though many adoption agencies today offer post-adoption support that often includes resources for respite care. If you can find it, use it. It will help. Connection with your child is extremely important. It really is the key to everything. And appropriate expectations are also very critical. Parenting methods like TBRI and Nurtured Heart are effective as a good foundation for parenting children with FASD. But many parenting ideas and practices do not work well or at all. Consequences as a way to change behavior, tough love, or other traditional style parenting that uses punishment as a behavior control or training method will fail miserably because it requires a healthy brain to work. And children with FASD don't have healthy brains. Holding a child responsible for behavior they cannot control does not work either. It just makes things worse. Okay, so what are some things caregivers can do that really work, that will help a child with FASD to thrive? Well, first, try focusing on changing the environment because that really works. Author Donna DeBolt is fond of saying, if the work is not about the environment, it's not going to work. You see, it's much easier to go ahead of the child and manipulate the environment to avoid possible landmines and other troubles than it is to try to change the child who has permanent impairments hardwired into their brains. Also, you need to take serious the impact of their environment upon them. Sometimes when your child starts to melt down, be an environmental detective and try to figure out What may have contributed to his or her overload? Maybe the lights were too bright. Maybe it was too warm or cold, or there was loud music or noises. Children with FASD often have sensory issues as well and find that these things can push them over the edge. Figure out what are their triggers and do your best to change that environment. Simplicity works. Students with FASD often do not do transitions very well. When having to stop one thing and move on to another, you have the greatest chance of a meltdown or a problem. So plan these ahead of time and, frankly, try to keep them to a minimum. Another thing that really works is the idea of an external brain. Teresa Kellerman explains this in her article, External Brain, and she says, the person who has impaired vision is given a seeing eye dog. The person with impaired hearing is given an interpreter or hearing aid. The person with cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy is given braces or a wheelchair. These external devices are necessary for the person with physical impairments to be able to function to maximum potential in life. So people with fetal alcohol need someone to be their external or second brain so they can have support when making important choices or decisions. Because of their poor impulse control and lack of judgment, if left on their own, they are likely to make poor choices, and we don't want to set them up for failure. Parents, teachers, doctors, friends, and mentors all make potential external brains, and it is totally okay to have more than one. Anyone who the kiddo is comfortable asking for this kind of help is good. This is really something that makes a difference in the lives of children with FASD, especially as they become adults. Another thing that really works is supervision and structure. Again, because of poor impulse control and poor judgment, it is never a good idea to leave a child with FASD to their own devices, because you're setting them up for disaster. The more structure, the better, because they know what to expect, and so do you. But do keep it simple. Simple is always good. It's also important to know how much supervision is needed, because if you overdo it, they will get upset and have a meltdown. If you have too little, boom, lots of trouble. Nathan Orey says in his article, The Meaning of and Use of Structure, he says, and I quote, in behavioral support, structure means doing the same thing in the same order, in the same manner, with the same cues and prompts, and with the same expectations. These are the rules. Structure of this sort anchors a person and stabilizes life. It provides them with things that are known and can be counted upon, unquote. You see, since they cannot see what's coming next, structure provides a predictable day for them so they don't have to think about what will happen next. This will make them feel more in control and competent, and that's a good thing. As Jeff Noble says, treat every day like the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. The same thing happens every day. But don't assume your student will remember the day before. It's a whole new day, baby. Another thing that works is enabling or bribing. It really does work. Now, it's really not enabling. Enabling has a negative connotation because it's helping someone do something they should not be doing, like abusing substances. We are really accommodating the child's handicap. It might look like enabling to others, but pay them no mind because they don't know the whole situation. Accommodating their request as much as you can will help you avoid many battles, which in turn gives you some of the peace and quiet you were looking for. By the way, motivating a student with a reward can work really well if the task is within their ability to accomplish. If they are likely to fail, the reward just amplifies their frustration if they fail. Another thing that works is normalizing. People living with FASD want to be normal like everybody else. So what happens is that sometimes as we are accommodating them, we can accidentally embarrass them. If you can convince your student that it's not a big deal, or that everybody has something, and be discreet, of course, they can stop thinking that it's a big deal and it becomes part of normal to them. Sometimes if they see you or someone else doing that thing that makes them feel abnormal, they'll relax. Another thing that works is helping them develop good habits. Man, does that bring so many good results. Now, habits are formed by doing the same thing again and again and again until we are able to do the task without thinking about doing it. Think of like riding a bike, eating, brushing our teeth. Now, habits are a very positive thing that help a child with FASD tremendously. However, you have to remember it may take them way longer to get that habit. And even then, they can lose the habit from time to time. This is not an easy thing to do, but it is really beneficial. And lastly, remember to individualize. Individualizing really works. Always remember, each child with FASD is unique. Some practices and techniques work for some and not for others. If you have more than one child with FASD like I have, you have to be careful not to try to treat them exactly the same, because they aren't. Well, that's a lot to process, but you will find there is a lot of help that you can draw out of this presentation. Here on the screen is a quick list of more support resources. Some are online, some are recommended reading, and some are support groups. I cannot urge you enough. Get support. Make a self-care plan today that includes face-to-face as well as online support from people who are dealing with FASD in their own families, because they get it and you need that. Thank you for taking time to learn about FASD. For more information or to contact Transformational Families, go to www.tfmnotalone.org. You'll be glad you did.